In the cold depths of space, where civilizations rise and fall like distant stars, there exists a universal truth that even the most advanced species struggle to understand. Never underestimate the fury of a parent who has lost their child. The Zilithian Empire had ruled through fear for 3 millennia, crushing entire worlds beneath their iron grip. They had perfected the art of terror, turning rebellion into whispered nightmares and hope into forbidden dreams. Their biomechanical warships could glass planets in hours, their neural torture devices could break the strongest minds in minutes, and their clone armies numbered in the billions. But they had never encountered humans. When the first human colony ships arrived in Zilithian space, the aliens saw nothing more than another primitive species to be catalogued, enslaved, and eventually exterminated. Soft flesh, simple technology, no natural armor or claws. What threat could these fragile beings possibly pose to an empire that had conquered half the galaxy? They were about to learn that some forces in the universe cannot be measured by conventional weapons or calculated by military strategists. Some forces can only be understood when it's already too late to stop them. This is the story of that reckoning. This is the story of what happens when those who govern by terror discover that they have awakened something far more terrifying than themselves. This is the story of humanity's first war and the Zilithian Empire's last. The mining colony of New Brisbane had been humanity's farthest outpost for exactly 3 years, 7 months, and 12 days, when the Zilithian ships appeared in their sky like dark omens against the morning sun. Commander Sarah Chen watched through the observation deck of the colony's primary habitat dome as the massive vessels descended through the atmosphere, their biomechanical hulls writhing with organic components that seemed to pulse with malevolent life. "Ma'am, we're receiving a transmission," reported Lieutenant Torres from the communications station, his voice tight with barely controlled fear. The message that followed would echo through human history forever, though none of them knew it yet. "Primitive inhabitants of this world." The translation matrix rendered the alien words in cold, mechanical tones. "You have established illegal presence in Zilithian territory. You will submit for processing and relocation to designated labor facilities. Resistance will result in immediate termination of your species classification from sentient to resource material." Sarah felt her blood turn to ice. New Brisbane was home to 12,000 colonists, including nearly 3,000 children who had been born on this world. Families who had traveled across the void seeking a better life, scientists pushing the boundaries of human knowledge, engineers building humanity's future among the stars. All of them now facing an ultimatum from beings they had never encountered. "Transmit back," Sarah ordered, her voice steady despite the fear clawing at her chest. "This is Commander Sarah Chen of the United Earth Colonial Administration. We are peaceful settlers operating under the Colonial Charter of 2387. We have no knowledge of Zilithian territorial claims and request immediate diplomatic contact to resolve this misunderstanding." The response came swiftly, accompanied by a demonstration that would haunt her dreams for the rest of her life. One of the alien vessels fired a single pulse of crimson energy at a nearby mountain peak. Where solid rock had stood moments before, only a crater of molten glass remained, still glowing with residual heat that warped the air above it. "There is no misunderstanding," came the alien voice. "There is only compliance or termination. You have one standard time period to prepare for processing. Any attempt to leave this world will result in immediate destruction." As if to emphasize their point, 3 sleek human transport ships that had been approaching the colony from the outer system suddenly erupted in silent balls of fire. Their crews of 47 men and women vaporized before they could even send a distress signal. Dr. James Morrison, the colony's chief xenobiologist, had gone pale as he monitored the alien transmissions from his laboratory. "Commander," he called over the comm system, "I'm detecting massive energy buildups from multiple points around the planet. They're establishing some kind of planetary containment field." Sarah closed her eyes for a moment, feeling the weight of 12,000 lives pressing down on her shoulders. When she opened them again, her gaze fell upon the colony's primary school, visible through the dome's transparent aluminum walls. Children were playing in the courtyard, their laughter carrying faintly through the recycled air. They had no idea that their world was about to change forever. "All department heads to the command center immediately," she announced over the colony-wide communication system. "Emergency Protocol 7 is now in effect." Within minutes, the colony's leadership had assembled in the cramped command center. Dr. Morrison represented the Science Division, Engineer Patricia Valdez spoke for Infrastructure, Security Chief Marcus Webb handled Colony Defense, and Dr. Morrison Pess. Elizabeth Hayes led the Medical Department. Each of their faces reflected the same mixture of fear and determination that Sarah felt burning in her own chest. "Options?" Sarah asked without preamble. Webb spoke first. His scarred hands clenched into fists. The former Earth Defense Force sergeant had seen action in the asteroid belt conflicts, but nothing had prepared him for this. We've got maybe 200 colonists with military experience, mostly mining equipment adapted for basic defensive purposes. Against ships that can vaporize mountains? He shook his head grimly. We might last an hour if we're lucky. The communication array, Doctor, Morrison interjected. If we can get a message back to Earth, tell them what's happening here. Earth is 47 light-years away, Patricia interrupted, her engineer's mind cutting through false hope with brutal efficiency. Even if our message gets through, even if Earth immediately dispatches the entire colonial defense fleet, it would take them months to reach us. We'll be long dead or worse by then. Dr. Hayes, who had been quietly reviewing data on her tablet, finally spoke. There might be another option. The Zilithians mentioned processing and labor facilities. That suggests they want us alive, at least initially. If we comply, if we cooperate, maybe we can buy time to find another solution. The silence that followed her words was heavy with unspoken implications. They all knew what cooperation would mean, slavery at best, the complete subjugation of everything they had built, everything they had hoped for among the stars. No. The voice came from an unexpected source. 8-year-old Tommy Rodriguez, who had somehow slipped into the command center despite the security protocols. His father, Miguel Rodriguez, was the colony's head of agriculture, and the boy often wandered the administrative areas after school. My teacher says we never give up. She says humans always find a way. Security Chief Webb moved to escort the boy out, but Sarah held up a hand to stop him. Something in the child's eyes, a fierce determination that seemed far too old for his young face, gave her pause. Tommy, she said gently, kneeling down to his level. This is different from what you learn in school. Sometimes adults have to make very hard choices to keep people safe. But you said we were explorers, Tommy insisted, his voice carrying the absolute certainty that only children possess. You said we came here to build something better. If we give up now, what happens to my little sister? What happens to all the little kids? The boy's words hit Sarah like a physical blow. Tommy's sister, Maria, was only 4 years old, born in the low gravity of New Brisbane's carefully maintained atmosphere. Like all the colony children, she had never seen Earth, never breathed unfiltered air, never looked up at a natural sky. This world was their home, in a way it would never be for the adults who had brought them here. Dr. Morrison's tablet chimed with an incoming analysis. Commander, I've been monitoring their communications. The Zilithians are discussing something they call genetic diversity sampling. They're particularly interested in our children. The temperature in the room seemed to drop several degrees. Each of the adults present had their own mental image of what genetic diversity sampling might entail, and none of those images were pleasant. How long until their deadline? Sarah asked, though she dreaded the answer. 17 hours and 33 minutes, Torres reported from his station. Sarah looked around the room at the faces of her people, her friends, her colleagues, her responsibility. Outside the command center, life in New Brisbane continued its normal routine. People worked in the hydroponic farms, children attended classes, couples planned for the future, all of them trusting her to find a way through this nightmare. We need to assume that compliance means death just delayed, she said finally. Or something worse than death. Begin immediate implementation of the Lazarus Protocol. The Lazarus Protocol was something they had hoped never to use, a complete evacuation plan designed for catastrophic mining accidents or atmospheric failures. Every colonist would be awakened in the middle of the night, given emergency supplies, and moved to predetermined shelters throughout the planet's cave systems. It wasn't a long-term solution, but it might buy them time. Commander, Webb said quietly, even if we successfully hide the entire population, the Zilithians will just start glassing the surface until they find us.
We're not talking about hiding from orbital sensors for a few hours.
These beings have technology we can't even comprehend. As if summoned by his words, another alien transmission crackled through their communication system. This time, the voice was different, colder, more clinical. Attention human specimens. We have completed initial analysis of your species parameters. You will be pleased to learn that you have been classified as suitable for advanced psychological conditioning studies. Your young offspring show particular promise for our cognitive development programs. Preparation teams will begin surface deployment in 16 hours. Compliance will be rewarded with minimal suffering during the adaptation process. The casual cruelty in those words, the clinical detachment with which these beings discussed the torture and experimentation they planned to inflict on children, ignited something primal in Sarah's mind. She had spent her entire adult life in service to humanity's expansion into the stars, believing that they would find their place among the cosmic community through peaceful exploration and scientific advancement. But these creatures weren't interested in peace or science. They were predators, pure and simple, who saw humanity as nothing more than laboratory animals to be catalogued and experimented upon. "Change of plans," Sarah announced, her voice carrying a steel that surprised even herself. "We're not hiding, and we're not surrendering. Webb, I want every person in this colony who can hold a weapon armed and ready. Patricia, begin sabotaging every piece of infrastructure that might be useful to them. Morrison, start working on ways to disrupt their technology. Hayes, prepare medical stations in the deep shelters. Commander, Doctor," Hayes said carefully. "What exactly are you proposing?" Sarah looked out through the command center's windows at the alien ships hanging in their sky like mechanized vultures.
"I'm proposing we show these bastards that humans don't go quietly into the night."
"If they want our children, they're going to have to pay for them in blood." The next 16 hours passed in a blur of desperate preparation. Every adult colonist was briefed on the situation, and to Sarah's surprise and pride, not a single person suggested surrender. Mining explosives were repurposed into improvised weapons. Emergency shelters were stocked with supplies for extended siege conditions. Children were moved to the deepest, most protected areas of the colony's underground sections. Dr. Morrison worked frantically to analyze the Zalithian technology, looking for any weakness they might exploit. His preliminary findings were not encouraging. The alien ships used some form of biomechanical integration that defied human understanding of physics and engineering. But buried in the electromagnetic spectrum analysis, he found something interesting. "Their communication systems," he reported to Sarah as the deadline approached. "They're using some kind of quantum entanglement network, but it's being generated by organic components. If we could disrupt the biological elements, what would that accomplish?" Sarah asked. "At minimum, it would cut their ships off from each other and from any central command structure. At maximum, it might cause feedback that could damage their systems. I'd need to get close to one of their vessels to implement it, though." Sarah nodded grimly. "Do it." As New Brisbane's sun set for what might be the last time, the colonists of humanity's farthest outpost prepared for war. They had no illusions about their chances. They were 12,000 civilians armed with mining equipment, facing an enemy that could destroy mountains with casual ease. But they also had something the Zalithians had never encountered before: the desperate fury of parents protecting their children, and the stubborn refusal of human beings to accept the unacceptable. The alien ships began their descent as darkness fell across New Brisbane, their biomechanical hulls glowing with bioluminescent patterns that painted the landscape in sickly green light. In the colony's deepest shelters, children slept fitfully while their parents prepared for humanity's first interstellar war. None of them knew that their desperate last stand would echo across the galaxy, inspiring legends that would outlive civilizations. They only knew that their children were in danger, and that they would rather die fighting than live as slaves. The battle for New Brisbane was about to begin, and the universe would never be the same. The Zalithian ground forces descended like a plague of metal and flesh, their transport vessels disgorging hundreds of soldiers onto New Brisbane's surface as the first pale light of dawn crept across the horizon. From her position in the colony's observation tower, Commander Sarah Chen watched through high-powered scopes as the alien infantry deployed with the mechanical precision of beings who had conquered countless worlds. Each Zalithian soldier stood nearly 8 feet tall, their bodies encased in biomechanical armor that seemed to breathe and pulse with its own life. Organic tubes snaked across their forms, connecting weapon systems to their nervous systems in ways that made Dr. Rayalodon, Morrison's analysis equipment, register readings that shouldn't have been possible. They moved with the fluid grace of predators, their elongated limbs carrying them across the rough terrain with disturbing ease. "Contact in Sector 7, reported Marcus Webb over the communication network, his voice crackling with static from the improvised radio system they'd cobbled together overnight. 20 aliens moving toward the primary water treatment facility. They're scanning everything with some kind of energy projection." Sarah gripped her improvised weapon, a mining laser that had been modified to produce a coherent beam capable of cutting through reinforced steel, and tried to calm the racing of her heart. Around her, the colonists of New Brisbane prepared for a battle none of them had trained for, against an enemy none of them understood. In the deepest section of the underground shelter network, Dr. Elizabeth Hayes monitored the vital signs of 3,000 children who had been placed in medically induced sleep to keep them quiet and calm during the coming chaos. Among them lay 4-year-old Maria Rodriguez, Her tiny form connected to life support systems that would keep her safe even if the main power grid failed. Her brother Tommy had refused sedation, insisting that someone needed to help the grown-ups protect his sister. The first shots of humanity's interstellar war were fired by Private Jennifer Walsh, a former Earth Defense Force sniper who had retired to New Brisbane to start a family. She watched through her scope as a Zalithian patrol approached the colony's main power station, their alien forms moving with the casual arrogance of beings who had never faced serious resistance. Walsh's first shot took the lead alien directly in what appeared to be its head, the modified mining laser punching through its biomechanical helmet in a spray of green fluid and sparks. The creature stumbled but did not fall, instead releasing a sound that was part shriek and part electronic distress call. The other aliens in the patrol immediately scattered for cover, their movements becoming less fluid and more frantic. First blood to humanity, Walsh reported with grim satisfaction, cycling her weapon for another shot. But these things don't go down easy. The alien's response was swift and terrible. One of the creatures raised what looked like a grotesque fusion of rifle and living organism, the weapon's organic components contracting as it fired. A bolt of energy that seemed to bend light around itself struck the building where Walsh was positioned, and half the structure simply ceased to exist, its molecular bonds disrupted at a fundamental level. Walsh threw herself backwards just as the wall behind her vanished, tumbling into the lower level of the building with burns across her arms from the energy discharge's periphery. "They've got some kind of molecular disruptor," she called into her radio. "Don't let them get a clean shot." Throughout New Brisbane, similar encounters were erupting as the Zalithian forces encountered their first taste of human resistance. What the aliens had expected to be a simple collection operation was turning into something far more complex and dangerous than their previous conquests. Dr. Morrison crouched in the maintenance tunnels beneath the colony's communication array, working frantically to implement his plan to disrupt the alien communication network. His hand shook as he connected the improvised quantum resonator to the main power coupling, knowing that he had perhaps minutes before the aliens traced the source of the human resistance to this location. The device was a masterwork of desperate engineering. Components salvaged from laboratory equipment, mining sensors, and even parts of the colony's entertainment system, all jury-rigged into something that Morrison hoped would generate the specific electromagnetic frequency needed to disrupt the organic components of Zalithian technology.
"Morrison to command," he whispered into his radio headset.
Beginning the electromagnetic pulse sequence. If this works, their ships should lose communication with each other for at least several minutes. If it doesn't work, he didn't finish the sentence. They all knew what would happen if his gambit failed. Above ground, the battle was intensifying with each passing minute. The colonists had the advantage of knowing their terrain intimately, using maintenance tunnels, service corridors, and hidden passages to strike at the alien forces from unexpected angles. But the Zalithians possessed technology that seemed to violate the laws of physics as humans understood them. Engineer Patricia Valdez led a team of 6 colonists through the water treatment facility's maze of pipes and processing tanks, using her knowledge of the system's layout to set up ambush points against the alien patrol that had been detected in their sector. Each of her team members carried mining charges powerful enough to blast through solid rock, repurposed now as improvised grenades. "Remember," she whispered to her team as they took positions around a central processing chamber, "we're not trying to win a fair fight. We're trying to make them pay for every inch of our home." The Zalithian patrol entered the chamber with their characteristic fluid grace, their biomechanical sensors scanning the industrial equipment for signs of human presence. What they found instead was Patricia's carefully planned welcome. Explosive charges detonated in sequence, bringing down support beams and creating a cascade of structural collapse that trapped 3 of the aliens under tons of debris. But even buried under crushing weight, the creatures did not die. Their biomechanical armor seemed to be keeping them alive, and, more disturbingly, they appeared to be adapting to the damage, their organic components regenerating and restructuring themselves to cope with the injuries. "They're not dying!" Patricia called into her radio, watching in horror as one of the trapped aliens began to push aside chunks of concrete that should have been impossible for any creature to move. "The explosives aren't killing them." That discovery was spreading throughout the human resistance as similar encounters played out across the colony. The Zalithians were proving to be remarkably resilient, their biomechanical nature allowing them to survive damage that would have been instantly fatal to any normal biological organism. In the colony's medical center, Dr. Hayes received wounded colonists who reported increasingly disturbing details about their alien opponents. Burns from energy weapons that seemed to continue spreading even after the initial injury, exposure to some kind of neural disruption field that caused temporary paralysis, and most troubling of all, Reports that the aliens seemed to be learning and adapting to human tactics with each engagement. Dr. Hayes called Nurse Catherine Park, her voice tight with strain. "You need to see this." Hayes rushed to the examination room where Park was treating mining supervisor Carl Johnson, who had been caught in the edge of one of the alien energy weapon discharges. What she saw made her medical training struggle to provide explanations. Johnson's wounds were unlike anything in medical literature. The energy discharge had not simply burned his tissue, it had somehow altered it at a cellular level, causing his skin to take on a grayish metallic appearance. More disturbing still, the affected areas seemed to be spreading slowly across his body, as if the alien energy was some kind of infection. "Carl," Hayes said gently, taking readings with her medical scanner. "How do you feel? Any pain, numbness, unusual sensations?" Johnson looked at his transformed arm with a mixture of fear and fascination.
It doesn't hurt, Doc. But I can feel things differently.
Like there are signals in the air, electromagnetic frequencies. It's like the aliens turned part of me into some kind of receiver. Before Hayes could respond to this disturbing revelation, Morrison's voice crackled over the colony communication system. "Electromagnetic pulse in 3, 2, 1 now." The effect was immediately visible through the medical center's windows. The Zilithian ships hanging in the sky suddenly flickered, their bioluminescent patterns going dark for several seconds before slowly beginning to pulse back to life. More importantly, the organized movement of the alien ground forces became chaotic and confused as their communication network was disrupted. "It worked," Morrison's voice was filled with exhausted triumph. "Their ships have lost coordination. Ground forces are operating independently." But the celebration was short-lived. The electromagnetic pulse that had disrupted the alien communication network had also interfered with much of the colony's own electronics. Emergency lighting flickered throughout the underground shelters, and several of the medical monitoring systems watching over the sleeping children began to show warning indicators. "Medical emergency in shelter section C," reported Dr. Cole. Hayes urgently. "The pulse affected our life support systems. I need a maintenance team down here immediately." 8-year-old Tommy Rodriguez had been helping distribute emergency supplies when the electromagnetic pulse hit, and he was among the first to notice that something was wrong in the children's shelter. The soft hum of the air recycling system had changed pitch, and the gentle blue glow of the bio-monitoring displays was flickering erratically. "Miss Hayes," he called, running to find the doctor. "Something's wrong with the sleeping machines." Hayes arrived at the shelter's medical station to find a scene from her worst nightmares. The medically induced sleep systems that had been keeping the children calm and safe were beginning to fail, and as the sedation wore off, 3,000 children were starting to wake up in a dark underground shelter filled with the sounds of distant explosions and weapons fire. "Tommy," she said urgently, "I need you to help me keep the other children calm while we fix the machines. Can you do that?" The boy nodded with the serious determination that adults had noticed in him since the crisis began. As Hayes and her medical team worked frantically to restore the failing systems, Tommy moved among the waking children, speaking to them in the calm, reassuring voice he had learned from watching the adults around him. "It's okay," he told his 4-year-old sister Maria as she began to cry. "The grown-ups are taking care of everything. We just need to be brave and stay quiet." But even as Tommy worked to calm the other children, he could hear the sounds of battle growing closer to their shelter. The adults were fighting as hard as they could, but the aliens were slowly advancing through the colony, despite the chaos caused by Morrison's electromagnetic pulse. Above ground, Commander Sarah Chen coordinated the human resistance from her command post in the observation tower, watching as her people fought with a desperation born of protecting their children. The electromagnetic pulse had given them a temporary advantage, but she could see that the alien forces were adapting and regrouping. "All teams, this is Chen," she called over the radio network. "The aliens are consolidating their positions around the main habitat domes. They're trying to force us into direct confrontation rather than hit-and-run tactics. Do not engage them in open combat. Maintain guerrilla protocols and keep them guessing." But even as she gave these orders, Sarah could see the writing on the wall. The colonists were civilians armed with improvised weapons, fighting trained soldiers with technology that seemed centuries ahead of anything humans possessed. They had surprised the aliens with their initial resistance, but surprise would only carry them so far. Security Chief Webb's voice crackled over the radio with a report that confirmed her worst fears. "Command, this is Webb. I've got visual on alien reinforcements deploying from their ships. Looks like they're bringing in some kind of heavy support units. These things are... Jesus, Sarah, they're massive." Through her observation scope, Sarah watched as new Zilithian forces descended to the planet's surface. These were not the same sleek soldiers they had been fighting. These were enormous creatures that seemed to be more machine than biological, their forms bristling with weapon systems and armor plating that glowed with the same sickly green bioluminescence as their ships. "All teams," she called urgently. "Fall back to secondary positions. Repeat, fall back immediately. We've got incoming heavy assault units." As the human defenders retreated deeper into their prepared positions, the Zilithian heavy assault units began systematically destroying the colony's surface structures. Buildings that had taken years to construct were reduced to molecular dust in seconds, the aliens erasing every trace of human presence with clinical efficiency. But in their underground shelters, surrounded by 3,000 sleeping children and armed with nothing but desperation and improvised weapons, the colonists of New Brisbane continued to resist. They had drawn first blood in humanity's interstellar war, and though they were vastly outnumbered and outgunned, they had proven that humans would not surrender without a fight. The battle was far from over, and in the deeper tunnels beneath the colony, Dr. Morrison was already working on his next gambit, a plan so desperate and dangerous that it might either save them all or doom them to a fate worse than death. The Zilithians had expected easy conquest, but they were discovering that humanity had a quality their previous victims had lacked: the absolute refusal to accept defeat when their children were threatened. Soon, they would learn just how dangerous that quality could be. The Zilithian heavy assault units had been systematically destroying New Brisbane for 6 hours when they made their fatal mistake. Commander Thekvar, a veteran of 47 planetary conquests, ordered his forces to begin deep excavation protocols to force the human survivors from their underground shelters. What followed would haunt the dreams of every Zilithian who survived to tell the tale. The massive biomechanical drilling units descended into the earth with the grinding sound of metal tearing through stone, their organic components secreting acidic compounds that dissolved rock and metal alike. Their target was Shelter Section C, the deepest part of the colony's underground network, where Dr. Elizabeth Hayes was desperately trying to keep 3,000 children alive with failing life support systems. 8-year-old Tommy Rodriguez felt the vibrations through the shelter floor long before the adults realized what was happening. The steady thrumming of the alien drilling equipment resonated through the bedrock itself, growing stronger with each passing minute. Around him, children who had been kept calm through the worst of the fighting began to cry as the shelter walls shook with increasing violence.
"Miss Hayes," Tommy said urgently, tugging at the doctor's coat as she worked to repair another failing life support unit. "They're coming down here."
"I can feel them getting closer." Hayes paused in her work, pressing her hand against the shelter wall. The vibrations Tommy had felt were indeed growing stronger, and now she could hear it too, the horrible grinding sound of something massive boring through the earth directly above them.
"Emergency evacuation!"
She called to her medical team. "All children to the deepest tunnels immediately. Move them now." But even as the medical staff began waking and moving the sedated children, everyone in the shelter could feel the truth. There was nowhere deeper to go. The aliens were drilling directly toward their position, and the children were too young and too many to move quickly through the narrow emergency passages. Tommy Rodriguez made his decision in that moment, with the clarity that sometimes comes to children facing impossible situations. While the adults rushed around trying to organize an evacuation that everyone knew would be too slow, he slipped away from the group and climbed up through a maintenance shaft toward the surface. He had heard the adults talking when they thought the children weren't listening. He knew that his little sister Maria and all the other sleeping children couldn't be moved fast enough. He knew the aliens were going to break through the shelter walls within minutes. And he knew, with the absolute certainty that only 8-year-old minds possess, that someone had to do something to protect them. Tommy reached the surface level just as the first Zilithian drilling unit broke through the colony's outer defenses. The massive biomechanical creature was unlike anything he had imagined. A fusion of insectoid limbs, metallic armor, and pulsing organic components that dripped acidic compounds onto the ground around it. Its multiple eyes focused on him with alien intelligence as he emerged from the maintenance shaft. The child stood barely 4 feet tall in his emergency evacuation suit, clutching a broken piece of mining equipment that he had picked up somewhere along the way. To the Zilithian drill operator, he represented nothing more than a minor obstacle to be cleared away before continuing the excavation process. What happened next would be debated by xenobiologists for centuries to come. The Zilithian raised what appeared to be a standard crowd control device, a neural disruptor designed to cause temporary paralysis in most biological organisms. The weapon discharged with a crackling sound that seemed to bend the air around it. Tommy Rodriguez was struck directly by the neural disruptor's energy field, For a moment, his small form was outlined in crackling electricity as alien technology designed to subdue entire populations coursed through his nervous system. Then, the weapon overloaded. The neural feedback that resulted from the device's malfunction didn't just disable the weapon, it sent a cascade of electrical energy back through the biomechanical drilling unit, causing its organic components to convulse and spasm. The massive creature let out a sound that was part mechanical screech and part organic death cry as its nervous system overloaded and shut down. Tommy Rodriguez collapsed to the ground, his small body smoking from the electrical discharge, his eyes staring sightlessly at the alien sky. But in the moments before he died, something extraordinary happened. The neural disruptor had been designed to interface with alien nervous systems, to read and manipulate the electrical patterns of conscious thought. When it struck Tommy, it had briefly connected his dying mind to the Zilithian communication network that linked every soldier, every ship, every command center in their invasion force. For exactly 4.7 seconds, every Zilithian within 100 light-years experienced the death of a human child from the inside. They felt his fear for his little sister sleeping in the darkness below. They experienced his desperate determination to protect the other children, even knowing he would die in the attempt. They felt the pure, innocent love of a brother trying to save his family, and they felt that love cut short by their own weapons. The psychological impact on a species that had spent 3 millennia carefully avoiding emotional connections to their victims was devastating. Across the invasion fleet, Zilithian soldiers began experiencing something their race had engineered out of their society generations ago: empathy. Commander Sarah Chen was coordinating the defense of Shelter Section A when every Zilithian unit on the planet suddenly stopped moving. Through her observation scope, she watched in amazement as alien soldiers who had been advancing with mechanical precision began standing motionless, their biomechanical armor flickering with erratic electrical patterns. "Chen to all teams," she called urgently into her radio. "The aliens have stopped moving. Repeat. All alien forces have ceased forward movement. Unknown cause." Dr. Morrison, still working frantically in the maintenance tunnels to implement his next desperate gambit, felt the change through his improvised monitoring equipment. "Command," he reported, his voice filled with wonder. "I'm reading massive electrical fluctuations throughout their entire network. It's like their whole communication system is overloading." But the truth of what was happening was more profound than mere technical malfunction. Aboard the Zilithian command vessel, Supreme Overlord Vexstar was experiencing sensations his species had forgotten existed. The neural feedback from Tommy Rodriguez's death had propagated through their quantum entanglement network like a virus of consciousness, forcing every Zilithian mind to confront the reality of what they were doing. For 3,000 years, the Zilithian Empire had maintained its dominance through careful emotional suppression. Their society was built on the principle that empathy was weakness, that feeling for their victims would make conquest impossible. They had bred compassion out of their genetic code and trained it out of their military forces. But Tommy Rodriguez's dying mind had been pure human emotion, love, sacrifice, determination, and innocence distilled into its most powerful form. The neural interface had forced that experience directly into their consciousness, bypassing every psychological defense they had constructed over millennia. In Shelter Section C, Dr. Hayes and her team had reached the children when the drilling above them suddenly stopped. The massive biomechanical units that had been grinding toward them through solid rock went silent, their organic components seeming to shudder and withdraw.
"What's happening up there?"
whispered Nurse Catherine Park, holding 4-year-old Maria Rodriguez as the little girl cried for her missing brother. Hayes pressed her ear to the shelter ceiling, listening to the strange silence that had replaced the grinding of alien drilling equipment. "I don't know," she admitted, "but something has changed." Above them, throughout the invasion force, Zilithian soldiers were struggling with emotions they had never been trained to process. The Empire's psychological conditioning that allowed them to view other species as expendable resources was cracking under the assault of human emotional experience. Many of the lower-ranking soldiers simply shut down, their biomechanical armor entering protective stasis as their organic components tried to process incompatible psychological data. Others began removing their helmets, as if trying to escape the lingering echo of Tommy Rodriguez's sacrifice that still reverberated through their neural networks. But the most profound impact was felt by the command structure aboard the invasion fleet. These were Zilithians who had risen to power through absolute ruthlessness, who had personally overseen the conquest and enslavement of entire civilizations. They had thought themselves immune to the weakness of emotional attachment. Supreme Overlord Vexstar found himself staring at tactical displays that suddenly seemed incomprehensible. The strategic data showing human population centers, resource extraction possibilities, and optimal locations for labor camps was still there, but he could no longer process it in the same detached way. Every data point now carried the emotional weight of Tommy Rodriguez's love for his sleeping sister. "Report," Vextar commanded, his voice carrying harmonics of confusion that his subordinates had never heard before. "What is the status of the ground operation?" Fleet Commander Zenthikek, his own consciousness still reeling from the neural feedback, struggled to form coherent thoughts. "Sir, our forces have encountered unexpected psychological resistance. The human specimens appear to possess some form of neural warfare capability." The explanation was wrong, but it was the only framework the Zilithians possessed for understanding what they were experiencing. They could not conceive that a single child's death could carry such emotional power, could not understand that human beings were capable of love so pure and self-sacrificing that it could overwhelm their carefully constructed psychological defenses. Down in Shelter Section C, Maria Rodriguez had stopped crying and was now asking repeatedly for her brother Tommy. "Doctor." Hayes found herself unable to answer the little girl's questions, not knowing where the boy had gone or what had happened to him. The silence from above suggested that whatever Tommy had done, it had bought them precious time. But time for what? The Zilithian forces might have stopped their immediate assault, but they were still present, still vastly superior in numbers and technology. The electromagnetic pulse that Dr. Morrison had deployed earlier had only temporarily disrupted their communications. Soon they would adapt and resume their conquest. Commander Sarah Chen was thinking the same thoughts as she coordinated with her remaining team leaders. The mysterious pause in alien activities had given them a respite, but she knew it wouldn't last forever. They needed to use this time to prepare for the next phase of the battle. "Morrison," she called over the radio, "whatever you're working on down there, now would be a good time to implement it." Morrison's voice crackled back through the static-filled communication system, carrying a note of excitement that had been absent since the invasion began. "Commander, I think I understand what happened. The neural feedback from their own weapons has disrupted their ability to coordinate attacks. If I can amplify that effect, create a sustained interference pattern in their communication network, do it," Sarah ordered without hesitation. "Whatever the risks, do it." But as Morrison worked to implement his plan, none of the human defenders knew that the most significant change was taking place in the minds of their enemies. The Zilithian Empire's 3,000-year dominance had been built on the absolute suppression of empathy, and Tommy Rodriguez's sacrifice had cracked that foundation. Aboard the command vessel, Supreme Overlord Vextar was staring at a tactical display showing the location of Shelter Section C, where 3,000 human children lay sleeping in the darkness. For the first time in his long life, he found himself thinking not about their value as experimental subjects or labor resources, but about the brother who had died trying to protect them. The boy had known he couldn't stop the drilling units. He had known the neural disruptor would kill him, but he had climbed to the surface anyway, choosing certain death rather than let harm come to his sleeping sister. Vextar's biomechanical enhancements detected elevated stress patterns in his nervous system, emotions he had thought himself incapable of feeling. For the first time in 3 millennia, a Zilithian military commander was experiencing something that their victims would have recognized immediately: guilt. The battle for New Brisbane was far from over, but Tommy Rodriguez's sacrifice had accomplished something that weapons and tactics could not. He had forced an empire built on cruelty to confront the reality of its actions, and in doing so, he had planted the seeds of its destruction. His sister Maria continued to sleep in the darkness below, unaware that her brother had just changed the course of galactic history with 4 words he had spoken to Dr. Hayes: "We never give up." The Zilithian Empire was about to learn what those words meant to humanity and why they should have been afraid of them from the very beginning. The psychological breakdown of the Zilithian invasion force began exactly 37 minutes after Tommy Rodriguez died protecting his sister. Supreme Overlord Vextar stood in the command center of his flagship, watching tactical displays that showed his forces scattered across New Brisbane in complete disarray. Biomechanical soldiers who had conquered star systems were standing motionless on the battlefield, their weapons lowered, their neural interfaces flickering with erratic patterns that his technicians couldn't explain. "Sir," Fleet Commander Zenthiek reported, his own voice carrying harmonics of confusion and something else. Something that sounded dangerously like doubt. "Ground forces report continuing psychological interference. Many units are requesting permission to withdraw from combat operations." Vextar's primary optical sensors focused on his subordinate with predatory intensity. In 3,000 years of Zilithian military history, no unit had ever requested withdrawal from a simple pacification operation. The very concept was alien to everything their society had built itself upon. Impossible, Vexstar declared, though the harmonic frequencies of his voice suggested uncertainty even to himself. Zilithian forces do not retreat from inferior specimens, initiate neurological adjustment protocols for all affected units. But even as he gave the order, Vexstar found his own thought processes disrupted by persistent intrusions, flashes of memory that weren't his own, emotional responses that his biomechanical conditioning should have suppressed automatically. The dying child's neural pattern had embedded itself in their quantum communication network like a virus, spreading through every linked consciousness in their invasion fleet. Down in the maintenance tunnels beneath New Brisbane, Dr. Morrison was experiencing a breakthrough that would have seemed impossible just hours earlier. His improvised quantum resonator was detecting massive fluctuations in the Zilithian network, not the controlled disruption he had planned to create, but something far more chaotic and profound. "Commander Chen," he called excitedly into his radio headset, "I'm reading complete neural cascade failure throughout their command structure. Whatever happened on the surface has done more damage to their coordination than anything I could have engineered." Sarah Chen, coordinating the human defense from her command post, felt a flicker of hope for the first time since the invasion began. "What's your assessment, Morrison? Can we exploit this somehow?" "More than exploit it," Morrison replied, his voice filled with scientific excitement. "I think I can amplify it. The Zilithians use organic components in their neural networks, components that are apparently vulnerable to specific emotional resonance patterns. If I can recreate the neural signature of what happened earlier," Morrison didn't know that he was describing the neural pattern of a dying child's love for his sister. He only knew that the aliens' supposedly invincible technology was failing in ways that suggested fundamental vulnerabilities in their biomechanical integration. Aboard the Zilithian flagship, the neurological adjustment protocols were having effects that horrified the command staff. Instead of suppressing the emotional contamination spreading through their forces, the adjustment procedures were amplifying it. Soldiers who underwent the neural correction process emerged with their empathetic responses enhanced rather than eliminated, as if the human emotional patterns were somehow more robust than their own conditioning. "Commander," reported Chief Technician Caxnell, his biomechanical appendages trembling with what looked disturbingly like fear, "the neural adjustment protocols are producing adverse effects. Subjects are experiencing enhanced emotional responses, reduced aggression parameters, and some are refusing direct orders to harm human specimens." The words hung in the air of the command center like a death sentence. For the Zilithian Empire, a military force that refused to harm conquered populations was not just useless, it was antithetical to everything their civilization represented. In Shelter Section C, Dr. Elizabeth Hayes was witnessing a miracle that she didn't yet understand. The biomechanical drilling units that had been grinding toward her position had not only stopped, they were withdrawing. Through the shelter's emergency periscope system, she could see massive alien machines backing away from the excavation sites, their organic components seeming to shudder with what looked like revulsion. "Dr. Hayes," called Nurse Catherine Park from the medical monitoring station, "you need to see this. The children's vital signs are improving across the board. It's like whatever was causing them distress has stopped." 4-year-old Maria Rodriguez had indeed stopped crying, though she continued to ask for her brother Tommy with the persistent innocence of early childhood. What Dr. Hayes couldn't see was that the little girl's emotional state was somehow being transmitted through the same quantum neural network that connected the Zilithian forces. Her innocent confusion and grief adding another layer to the psychological cascade that was destroying the Empire's military effectiveness. The Zilithians had built their society on the principle that emotional connections were weakness, that empathy would make conquest impossible. But they had never encountered a species where emotional bonds were not weakness but strength, where love could drive individuals to acts of impossible courage and sacrifice. Security Chief Marcus Webb was leading a reconnaissance team through the colony's upper levels when they encountered their first evidence of the aliens' psychological breakdown. A Zilithian patrol unit was sitting motionless in what had once been the colony's central plaza, their weapons abandoned on the ground around them. As Webb's team approached cautiously, one of the aliens looked up at them with optical sensors that seemed somehow different, less predatory, more curious. "Human specimens," the alien said through its translation device, its voice carrying harmonics that sounded almost like regret. Query: "The small offspring that expired defending his clutchmates. What was his designation?" Webb felt his blood turn cold. The aliens were asking about one of the colonist children, which meant a child had died, and somehow the aliens knew about it. "I don't know what you're talking about," he replied cautiously, keeping his weapon ready, but not quite pointed at the creatures. "Clarification," the alien continued. its biomechanical components flickering with erratic patterns. Young male specimen, approximately 8 standard cycles. Neural pattern designation. Courage, love, sacrifice, protection. His emotional resonance has contaminated our command networks. We require understanding of this phenomenon. The other aliens in the patrol were nodding their elongated heads in what looked disturbingly like agreement. These were the same creatures who had been systematically destroying the colony just hours before, but something fundamental had changed in their behavior. Webb activated his radio carefully. "Command, this is Webb. I've got a situation here. The aliens they're asking about our children, and they don't seem hostile anymore." Commander Sarah Chen's response crackled through the static-filled communication system. "Repeat that, Webb." "Are you saying the aliens are communicating non-aggressively?" "More than that," Webb replied, never taking his eyes off the motionless patrol. "I think they're having some kind of breakdown. They keep talking about emotional contamination and neural pattern corruption. Throughout New Brisbane, similar encounters were taking place as human survivors encountered Zilithian forces that seemed fundamentally changed from the ruthless conquerors who had landed just hours earlier. The aliens were still physically imposing, still armed with technology that could destroy buildings with casual ease, but their behavior had become erratic and unpredictable. Dr. Morrison, monitoring these developments from his position in the tunnel network, was beginning to understand the full scope of what Tommy Rodriguez's sacrifice had accomplished. The boy's neural pattern, his love for his sister, his determination to protect the other children, his willingness to die rather than see them harmed, had been transmitted through the Zilithian communication network with the force of absolute truth. "Commander," Morrison reported, his voice filled with awe, "I don't think we're dealing with a technological malfunction. I think we've accidentally discovered that the Zilithian neural network is vulnerable to genuine emotional experiences. Their whole society appears to be built on suppressing natural empathetic responses, and exposure to human emotional patterns is causing system-wide psychological failure." The implications were staggering. If Morrison's analysis was correct, then humanity had stumbled upon a weapon more powerful than any military technology, the simple capacity for genuine emotional connection that their species had always taken for granted. Aboard the Zilithian flagship, Supreme Overlord Vexstar was struggling with concepts that had no place in his understanding of reality. The tactical displays still showed his forces in overwhelming numerical and technological superiority over the human colony. But those same forces were now reporting that they could not continue combat operations against the offspring specimens because their neural conditioning was preventing aggressive responses. "Fleet Commander," Vexstar said, his voice carrying harmonics of confusion and something else. Something that his biomechanical enhancements were unable to identify as shame. "Explain to me how a single expired juvenile specimen can neutralize an invasion fleet." Xanthe consulted his biomechanical interface, accessing data that became more disturbing with each analysis. "Sir, the human neural patterns appear to be more robust and complex than our psychological models predicted. Their emotional response systems are integrated into their decision-making processes in ways we did not anticipate. When the juvenile's neural pattern was transmitted through our network, it overwrote key aggression and dominance programming. In simpler terms, the Zilithians were discovering that human emotions were not the primitive weakness they had assumed. Instead, they represented a form of mental resilience that their own artificially enhanced psychology could not match or resist. The boy Tommy Rodriguez had died believing he was simply buying time for his sleeping sister and the other children in the shelter. He could never have imagined that his neural death pattern would propagate through an interstellar communication network, carrying with it the full emotional weight of human love and sacrifice. In Shelter Section C, his sister Maria had finally fallen asleep again, comforted by Dr. Hayes' promise that her brother was helping the grown-ups keep everyone safe. The doctor had no way of knowing how literally true that statement was. Above them, the Zilithian Empire was experiencing its first taste of defeat not through superior firepower or tactical brilliance, but through the simple power of a child's love for his family. The psychological foundations that had allowed them to conquer half the galaxy were cracking under the assault of emotions they had bred out of their own species generations ago. But the collapse was far from complete. Deep in the command structure of the invasion fleet, there were still Zilithians whose conditioning was strong enough to resist the emotional contamination, and they were beginning to formulate desperate responses to humanity's unexpected psychological warfare. The battle for New Brisbane was entering its final phase, and the outcome would determine not just the fate of one human colony, but the future of both species, in a galaxy that was about to witness the birth of something unprecedented in its history. 24 hours after Tommy Rodriguez died protecting his sister, the true scope of humanity's psychological warfare capabilities began to manifest across the Zilithian Empire. What had started as a single child's neural death pattern spreading through their communication network had evolved into something far more devastating, a cascading empathy plague that was tearing apart the psychological foundations of 3 millennia of conquest. Supreme Overlord Vexstar stood in the command center of his flagship, watching reports stream in from across their territorial holdings. On 17 different worlds, Zilithian occupation forces were refusing orders to suppress slave uprisings. In 12 star systems, labor camp administrators were releasing prisoners without authorization. Throughout the Empire's neural network, the simple concept of a child dying to protect his family had become a virus of consciousness that no amount of biomechanical conditioning could contain. "Sir," Fleet Commander Zentek reported, his voice carrying harmonics of something that Vexstar finally recognized as terror.
"We're receiving priority transmissions from High Command."
"The Imperial Council is demanding immediate explanation for the psychological contamination spreading through our forces." Vexstar's optical sensors focused on the tactical display showing New Brisbane far below, where 12,000 human colonists had somehow brought the greatest military force in galactic history to its knees without firing a single Starship-grade weapon. The irony was not lost on him that their most devastating defeat was coming at the hands of beings they had dismissed as primitive and weak. Dr. Morrison had spent the last 6 hours in the maintenance tunnels working frantically to understand and amplify the effects of what he was calling neurological resonance warfare. His improvised equipment was detecting quantum entanglement patterns that stretched across interstellar distances, carrying with them emotional signatures that were literally rewriting Zilithian neural programming. "Commander Chen," he reported through his radio headset, his voice filled with scientific wonder and growing horror at the implications of his discoveries. "I'm reading cascade effects throughout their entire communication grid. The neural pattern that started here on New Brisbane is propagating through their network at faster than light speeds. Their empire is experiencing system-wide psychological collapse." Sarah Chen, coordinating the human resistance from her command post, felt a mixture of triumph and unease. "What exactly are you saying, Morrison? Are we winning this war?" "We're not winning it," Morrison replied grimly. "We're ending it. The Zilithian Empire appears to be built on absolute suppression of empathetic responses. Exposure to genuine human emotional experiences is causing their entire social structure to break down. But Sarah, I don't think we can control what we've unleashed." His words proved prophetic. Across the galaxy, Zilithian-controlled worlds were erupting into chaos as military forces that had maintained iron discipline for centuries suddenly found themselves unable or unwilling to inflict suffering on their subjects. The neural pattern of Tommy Rodriguez's sacrifice had created a chain reaction that was liberating entire star systems. In Shelter Section C beneath New Brisbane, Dr. Field, Elizabeth Hayes was tending to the sleeping children when 4-year-old Maria Rodriguez woke up and asked the question that would haunt human history. "Where's my brother Tommy? I had a bad dream about him." Hayes found herself unable to answer. The truth that Tommy had climbed to the surface and died protecting these children seemed too heavy a burden to place on a 4-year-old's shoulders. But somehow, Maria seemed to sense that something terrible had happened. "He's not coming back, is he?" the little girl asked with the devastating clarity that children sometimes possess. "Tommy went away to keep the monsters from hurting us." Before Hayes could respond, the shelter's communication system activated with an incoming transmission that would change everything. The voice that emerged from the speakers was unlike anything they had heard from the aliens before. It carried harmonics of regret, confusion, and something that sounded almost like pleading. "Human specimens of New Brisbane colony," the transmission began. "This is Supreme Overlord Vexstar of the Zilithian Imperial Fleet. We request immediate communication with your leadership regarding cessation of hostilities." The words hit the shelter like a physical blow. The aliens, the same beings who had threatened to turn their children into experimental subjects, were asking for a ceasefire. Commander Sarah Chen's voice crackled through the shelter's internal communication system moments later. "All personnel remain in protective positions. I'm going to the surface to meet with the alien commander, if this is some kind of trap." But it wasn't a trap. When Sarah emerged from the colony's underground network, she found a scene that defied every expectation she had formed during the last 24 hours of warfare. The Zilithian ground forces were arranged in perfect formation across the colony's main plaza, but their weapons were laid out on the ground between them, and their biomechanical armor was flickering with patterns she had never seen before. Supreme Overlord Vexstar himself was waiting for her, his imposing form somehow diminished by the way his optical senses kept focusing on the spot where Tommy Rodriguez had died. When he spoke, his translator carried emotional harmonics that seemed impossible for a being of his species. "Commander Chen," he said, his voice carrying what could only be described as shame. "We have come to understand that our actions on your world constitute what your species would classify as evil. The neural pattern of the expired juvenile specimen has taught us what we have been doing to the galaxy for 3 millennia. Sarah felt her hand drift toward her weapon, but something in the alien's posture stopped her. This was not the arrogant predator who had delivered ultimatums just hours before. This was a being experiencing emotions his species had forgotten existed. "You're talking about Tommy Rodriguez," she said quietly, "an 8-year-old boy who died trying to protect his little sister." "Tommy Rodriguez," Vexstar repeated, the human name sounding strange in his alien voice. "His neural pattern has propagated through our communication network to every Zilithian consciousness in the Empire. We have experienced his final moments, his love for his clutchmate, his willingness to sacrifice himself for others. We have been forced to confront the reality that we are the monsters in this equation." As if to confirm his words, reports were flooding in from across Zilithian space. The Kethmori system, enslaved for 800 years, was free as Zilithian overseers released their prisoners and fled in confusion. The mining colonies of Vex Prime, where billions of beings had died in forced labor, were abandoned as their guards experienced massive psychological breakdowns. Throughout the Empire, the simple truth of a child's love was dismantling 3,000 years of institutionalized cruelty. "Doctor." Morrison emerged from the tunnel system, his improvised equipment still detecting the quantum resonance patterns that were spreading across the galaxy. "Commander," he reported, "the neural cascade is continuing to expand. I'm reading liberation events in over 40 star systems. The Zilithian Empire it's collapsing." But Vexstar's next words revealed the full scope of the crisis they had inadvertently created. "The liberation you describe is accompanied by chaos we cannot control. Our subject species are rising against their former oppressors, but many of our own people are experiencing complete neural breakdown. Entire fleets are drifting powerless through space as their crews grapple with centuries of suppressed guilt and horror at their actions." The implications were staggering. Humanity's accidental psychological warfare had not just defeated the Zilithian Empire, it had triggered a galactic revolution that was spiraling beyond anyone's control. Billions of enslaved beings were suddenly free. But the power vacuum left by the Empire's collapse was creating chaos on an interstellar scale. "What do you want from us?" Sarah asked, though she suspected she already knew the answer. "Guidance," Vexstar replied, his optical senses focusing on her with desperate intensity. "Your species possesses emotional capabilities that we have forgotten how to process. The neural pattern of Tommy Rodriguez has shown us what we have lost, but we do not know how to live with the knowledge of what we have done." It was perhaps the most extraordinary moment in galactic history. The supreme commander of a star-spanning empire begging a human colony leader to teach his species how to experience guilt and redemption. In the shelter below, Maria Rodriguez was asking Dr. Chorful Hayes to tell her a story about her brother. "Tell me about how Tommy was brave," the little girl said, not knowing that her brother's bravery was at that very moment reshaping the political structure of half the galaxy. Hayes found herself telling the story of a little boy who loved his sister so much that he was willing to face monsters to keep her safe, not knowing that this simple tale was literally true, on a scale that encompassed entire star systems. The immediate crisis on New Brisbane was over. The Zilithian forces were withdrawing from the planet, their invasion fleet preparing to return to an empire that no longer existed in any form they would recognize. But the larger crisis was just beginning. Across the galaxy, newly liberated worlds were descending into civil war as different species vied for control of territories abandoned by their Zilithian overlords. Former slave populations, many of whom had forgotten how to govern themselves after generations of oppression, were struggling to establish new societies, and throughout Zilithian space, an entire civilization was grappling with the psychological aftermath of confronting the true nature of their actions. Dr. Morrison's final report to Earth Command would become one of the most significant documents in human history. "We have accidentally triggered the collapse of the galaxy's dominant empire through the neurological transmission of pure human emotional experience. The death of 8-year-old Tommy Rodriguez has liberated 47 star systems and freed an estimated 12 billion sentient beings from slavery. However, the resulting power vacuum and psychological trauma affecting both liberated populations and former Zilithian forces represents a galactic humanitarian crisis of unprecedented scope. The message would take 47 years to reach Earth, but when it did, it would launch humanity into a new role as mediators and healers in a galaxy struggling to recover from millennia of oppression. The child who died protecting his sleeping sister had not just saved New Brisbane, he had accidentally unleashed a revolution that would reshape galactic civilization. Maria Rodriguez grew up never fully understanding why her brother Tommy was remembered as a hero across dozens of worlds. But every year on the anniversary of his death, beings from across the galaxy would send messages to New Brisbane, thanking the human colony for the child whose love had taught them what freedom meant. The Zalithian Empire had governed through terror for 3,000 years, believing that fear and pain were the only currencies that mattered in the universe. They learned too late that there were forces more powerful than terror, forces that could not be conquered or controlled, only respected and protected. The galaxy would never be the same again, and it all began with a little boy who refused to let the monsters hurt his sister while she slept in the darkness below.